Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. What I Found at an Abandoned Psychiatric Hospital, a True Occult Story by Starry Marquis. I'd like to preface this story by acknowledging that the truthfulness or reliability of asylum or escaped mental patient stories tends to be questionable. The reason why I'm skeptical of those stories is that large-scale closures of asylums began in 1967 through the 1980s and were completely decommissioned by 2015. So I raise my eyebrow whenever someone talks about spooky asylum stories that happened within the last 2 decades or so. Still, I will be sharing my story as factually as my memory allows and refrain from exaggerating any aspect because, unfortunately, this story is true through and through. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City, or TC, is a beautiful place, produces 75% of the world's cherries, and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1989. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the buildings on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourist traps, cafes, etc., but many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system which the hospital staff used to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. I am sure there were instances where the patients underwent cruel treatments or were subjected to the care of horrible doctors, but the TC Psych Hospital did have a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unashamedly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, we would often break into the abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating or trying to justify my criminal act of B&E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightened youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of those stories. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I never encountered anything supernatural in all of my trips to the abandoned TC Psych Hospital. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something all too human that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place one night around 10 p.m. The moonlight was dim and most patrol guards had left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used and followed our regular path to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the windows that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others. A new, faint, and unexplainable smoky odor. Not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint we almost thought we were imagining it, but it got stronger as we grew closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloody bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers, but I personally don't remember doing that. I wouldn't be too terribly surprised, though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way the guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be too crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running, and we obviously didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while. But thankfully, Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather gotten caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot, whether the cause was fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of both. I'm not sure what would have happened if the occultists caught us, but I know for certain they weren't going to crack open a beer and sing Kumbaya by the candlelight. I'm not familiar with cultic practices or satanic rituals, so I'm not sure what the men were trying to do or if they were summoning something. If anyone hearing this is more knowledgeable on the topic, please share your thoughts. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know that horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until we die. When a Man Follows You Home by Puzzle-Headed Use 566. I was 22 and living on my own for the first time when this happened, in the mid-90s. I had just gotten off work around 11 p.m. To reach my apartment building, I could either walk on the sidewalk that was lit with street lamps, decently trafficked, or cut across this communal garden, which was pitch black and set back from the street. It saved about 1 whole minute of walking time by cutting through the communal garden, but being young and stupid, a lot of times I took the shortcut. That night, I got the weird feeling not to take the shortcut. I kept to the sidewalk, but there was no one else around. When I got past the garden, all of a sudden, this large man popped up from its exit path. There was no way he could have been in front of me or just behind me as I was walking. I would have noticed him. The only logical explanation was he had been hiding in the pitch-black garden. A drunk who'd been sleeping it off? No, my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I began walking faster. My dad had taught me to always carry my keys in my fist with a key pointed out in case I needed to punch someone. So I had that, but I was 5'4" and probably weighed 110 pounds. This guy was tall and big. My only chance was to outpace him. So I speeded up my walking at that point, and I felt him matching my pace, getting closer. He was breathing heavily, and I felt this angry energy coming off of him. But my apartment building was right there, so I put a burst of speed on. When I reached the entrance, 2 people were leaving and held the door for me. And him. I don't know why I didn't tell them that I thought this guy was following me. My mind froze and I was just trying to get inside my apartment. Plus, I was still trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was visiting someone in the building. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Don't be paranoid. Besides, it only took a couple seconds for them to be out the door. I had missed my chance. I was climbing the stairs as fast as I could. It was a 3-story building and I lived on the 3rd floor. He was climbing the stairs too, rolling up right behind me, panting, that evil energy just emanating from him. I was fast, but he was putting on speed. I got to my floor, which had 4 apartments on the right side where I lived and 4 on the left. I passed by apartments 1 and 2, and he was still right behind me. I stopped at apartment 3 where I lived, and he stopped in front of apartment 4, where I know he does not live. He didn't say anything, he was just breathing hard, and I thought there's no way I'm going to open my apartment door and have him push me inside and rape me or worse. He also hadn't knocked on the door of apartment 4. Worth noting is that the apartments are U-shaped, with mine and my neighbor's door being very close together. So I banged on my own apartment door and as loud as I could yelled my neighbor's name. "Hey, Kevin, let me in!" Kevin's not his real name, but that startled the guy. Even more so when my own apartment door didn't open, but Kevin's did. Kevin saw the guy standing right in front of his door and asked what he wanted. The guy started mumbling something about the wrong apartment, but I had my own door open so fast that I was inside my place in a flash, locked the door behind me, grabbed my cordless phone to call the police, and then I heard Kevin through the door telling the guy he needed to leave. The guy did. Then Kevin knocked on my door, asked if I was okay, and I thanked him and said that I was, but inside I was still frozen scared with the adrenaline pumping. I thanked him again and told him to have a good night, and then locked my door again. I had my phone in my hand ready to call the police, but I started trying to rationalize it again. What exactly happened? A guy followed me home, but then said he had the wrong apartment. Are the cops going to care about something minor like that? I tried to calm myself down, but I was also berating myself. Why didn't I run the instant I felt him following me? Why didn't I tell the people we passed when the front door opened that I thought I was being chased? Worse, why didn't I tell Kevin the second he opened his door for him to save me? He could have let me inside his apartment and we could have called the cops together. But because of my stupidity, everything felt so ambiguous and I was questioning myself. A couple of weeks later, I was visiting my grandparents and my grandfather was reading the paper. He told me that a woman was raped in the apartment building across the street from mine. It was the same guy. He had multiple convictions for sexual assault and had recently been released on parole. Something creepy in the old house. Submitted by Sam. This one time, me and my girlfriend Erica were hiking in the woods, and I fell and lost my phone in some water. I just yelled out, "Shit." It was about 9 p.m. when this happened, and we were supposed to call my friend Vince to come and get us. I just said, "Damn, now what are we going to do?" We kept hiking, and it was now about almost 11 p.m. Pitch black, and out of nowhere we saw this faint light. And I said, "Shit, what are we going to do?" The only thing we could do was get closer. We saw that it was a house. It was really creaky, a beat-up old creaky house, and shit, I didn't know what to do. But we were miles from anywhere, and we had to sleep. And we'd been up since 8 a.m. So we took a chance and decided to sleep there for the night. We slept in the same room, even though I'm 15 and she was 16. I'm just kind of chicken. But then at like 3 a.m., we heard this crazy noise and a wall shattered. We heard a scream and something dart towards us in the dark. We jumped up and ran like hell for about 2 miles, just totally out of fear. But we were exhausted and finally found a parking lot and just started walking for another mile or so until someone named Mike came along and allowed us to use his cell to call one of our friends. Our friend didn't pick up, and neither did 2 of our other friends. But finally our friend Cash did pick up. His brother agreed to drive him out to get us, and we just had to sit around waiting there for Mike. Thank God Mike was so understanding. Damn, though, what the hell was in that house? Don't screw up like me and avoid creaky, spooky old houses in the woods. They're no place to sleep. Laced Cigarette by Little Miss Can't Do It. A few years back, when I was around 18, I entered a very rebellious phase in my life. I've always been a prodigy child. Always did as I was told, never stayed out late, didn't smoke, didn't drink, Scored the highest in all my classes. All my family, my friends, and my friends' families thought I was the perfect kid. But then something changed. I was on a lot of medication due to my health, and I started going through bouts of depression. I started acting up like never before. I stopped going to school, I would stay in bed all day, didn't talk to anyone, and then slowly I started talking to strangers online. Initially, it was just talking to them online. I would talk to a few people till I found someone interesting. Then I would dedicate all my time talking to them, till they no longer held my interest and then moved on to the next person. This went on for about a year. Then I eventually started meeting these people in person. Most of these meetings were sexual, and I was very reckless. I slept around with more people than I'd like to admit, and regardless of my lack of concern for my own safety, I somehow never met anyone that had any evil intentions. We'd meet a couple of times, do the dirty, and that was that, until I met this one guy. I was talking to a couple of guys at that time. I wasn't in any sort of relationship, but just being a hoe. So this guy starts talking to me and asks me about my hobbies, my interests, what I do. I told him I don't drink or smoke, and he was shocked. I told him it wasn't that I'd never done it. I tried, but just felt like it wasn't my thing. We talked for a couple of weeks, and I ended up talking about how I'd been going through depression, and at first he just listened. Eventually, he started telling me I should try smoking. It would help me relieve anxiety and stress, and I always turned it down. But he was relentless. After a month or so of talking online, we decided to meet. We'd never had any sort of sexual conversation or anything, so we were just going to meet as friends. I was supposed to meet another guy, an acquaintance, for something I needed, so I suggested to the online chat guy that we briefly meet for lunch, and then he could drop me off at the other guy's place. He agreed, and we decided on where and when to go. The day we were supposed to meet, we met at a local cafe. We had brunch, and then I got in his car for him to drop me off at the place that I had to go. It was a good 45-minute drive, so I put on some songs and decided to relax. 5 minutes into the drive, he offered me a cigarette. I declined. He insisted and kept insisting till I gave up and agreed. I opened the box, and there was only one cigarette in there. I told him it was his last one and asked if he was sure he wanted me to smoke it since he would have enjoyed it more than I. He said yeah, so I took the cigarette out, and there was something odd about it. It didn't look like it was store-bought. It rather looked like it had been rolled by hand. But then again, I had never smoked enough cigarettes to be sure, so I lit it and smoked it. I couldn't even smoke half of it. It made me inexplicably nauseous, so I gave up halfway through and offered it to him. Instead of smoking it, he put it out and threw it away. I thought it was weird, but assumed he probably didn't want to smoke while driving. 30 minutes into the ride, I started feeling very sick. My whole body was shaking, I was extremely nauseous, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I kept telling him I wasn't feeling good and that maybe we should go to the nearest ER instead of where we were going. But he kept telling me to relax and lay back. And everything about that ride felt off. I told him to stop the car and drop me off wherever we were, and he refused. All I could think of was pulling out my phone and calling for the police. And when he noticed what I was doing, he immediately stopped the car and I got out. I couldn't stand, so I sat on the roadside and called the guy I was supposed to visit. He immediately drove to where I was and picked me up, took me to his place where I threw up all over his living room multiple times. For the next hour and a half, I just laid on the couch, my whole body shaking and constantly throwing up. The guy brought me some water, gave me some electrolytes, and kept insisting on going to the hospital, but I refused. I have no idea what I had smoked, but I'm sure it wasn't just plain old cigarettes. I was scared that if it had been some illegal drug and if the hospital caught on, I would get into trouble, and I absolutely did not want my parents to find out what I had been up to. So I just lay there. I kept throwing up and letting whatever that shit was get out of my system. All these years later, I'm now married to the guy who picked me up from the roadside and helped me through an insanely embarrassing time. Oh, and to the guy that laced my cigarette, let's not meet. Uncle Josh note here. Yeah, some people might not think that this is creepy, but I assure you it is. When I was a kid, some guys from the city came out to a park that was right near my house, and a bunch of guys started smoking weed, just a couple of blunts. I wasn't smoking, but some people close to me were, and these guys were lacing it with something which I'm pretty sure was crack. This was late 80s, maybe 1990. And one of my buddies who smoked it with them was in bad shape, man. Bad shape. Couldn't move, just was laying there on his side, and he just would roll over and was covered in sweat. I mean, it was a summer day, but he was just pouring sweat. His heart rate was off the charts. I mean, he was just in bad shape. Something obviously he was not used to. And I'll tell you what, there's no crazy guy making stocky movements or anything like that in a story like that, but watching one of your buddies go through smoking something he has no idea what it is, it's a pretty fucking awful way to spend your afternoon. He eventually got through it just like the person in this story, so I saw this, had to share it. Rule here is, if you don't know where it came from, don't fucking use it. Better yet, don't use it at all. But certainly, don't use something where you don't know where it came from. And now it's time for one of the classics. Do you know David Crist by Alone in the Night? I love to ride my bike along country roads. Not far from where I live is a tiny town called Three Oaks in Michigan. One Saturday, my wife was working and I had nothing to do, so I strapped my bike to my car and drove the hour to Three Oaks. I parked in the scenic downtown area and then rode out of the town and into the surrounding countryside. As I wound my way further into the remote countryside, houses and businesses and cars grew increasingly scarce. Eventually, there were only an occasional house or two every half mile or mile, and cornfields and small woods flanking the dirt and gravel roads that I pedaled down. It's on one of those back roads that a minivan drove past me. Within moments of it passing, it turned around and pulled up alongside me. I looked over and the passenger, a woman in her mid to late 20s, was looking at me with her window down. The driver, a man of seemingly the same age, leaned over the passenger and said to me in a slight southern drawl and with a big smile on his face, "Hey, do you know David Crist?" I thought for a brief second, but I don't know any David Crist, so I said so. The driver said, "You don't know of him at all?" I said that I didn't and apologized, and then pedaled on. The van sat for a moment longer and then pulled a U-turn and drove off in the direction it was originally heading. I thought nothing of the encounter. I mean, maybe the driver was a friend of David Crist and he thought we had met through David or something. I don't know. At the time, I didn't think I had any reason to worry. I continued on my ride, turning down this road and heading north, and then turning down that road and heading east. I didn't have any agenda. I was just out to enjoy the summer day and meander through the relaxing countryside. Maybe 10 minutes later, and on an entirely new road and heading in an entirely different direction from the one I had first met the van, I saw the van again. We were heading towards each other, and I gave a smile and a nod as I passed the driver. I remember thinking it was an odd coincidence that I should come across this van again. The driver stared as he passed, and he had a big smile on his face. At this point, I began wondering what they were doing. They might be lost and looking for this David Crist guy, or maybe they were just enjoying a scenic drive and thought I looked like a friend of a friend or something. I didn't know, but at that point I was starting to think about the situation a little more critically. I continued taking a twisting, turning, meandering path. Taking this road, then turning onto that, heading north, south, west, east. Then I came across the van again. Again, they were heading in my direction, and I pulled alongside them. The driver rolled down his window and leaned out. He was in his late 20s, a white guy with a few inches of a goatee and a baseball cap. He had a large smile plastered across his face again. I stopped my bike and looked at him, waiting for him to say something. And he just looked at me for a good 30 seconds. Now, 30 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but you go flag down a stranger and then just look at them for 30 seconds, And you'll realize that in that kind of situation, 30 seconds is a lifetime. Finally, he spoke and said, "Hey, do you know David Crist?" Same damn question. This time there was no smile on his face. He stared at me, and I was thinking to myself, is he joking? Does he really not remember he asked me the same question 20 minutes ago? Is he just being funny? Is he as high as hell? After a moment, I told them that I still didn't know anyone by the name of David Crist, and I pedaled off down the road. It was at that time that I realized exactly in how remote of an area I was. I peered down the road I was on, and I didn't see a house on its entire length. I was flanked by a cornfield on one side and a forest on the other. I looked over my shoulder and saw the van slowly driving down the road away from me. It couldn't be a coincidence that I came across this van 3 times now, not with me taking random roads heading different directions. It made no sense why anyone driving would take the same maze of roads. The only thing they could have been doing was just driving around, maybe a pleasure drive. But why would they stop me and ask that same question twice? It was quite strange, and I was beginning to become a little concerned. I decided to begin to head back toward the town center. I pedaled hard, and the gravel road ahead of me continued with a bend to the right and a dirt path, for it couldn't be really called a road, to the left. As I neared the fork, who should come around the bend but the damned van? I gripped my pocket knife, which I always take with me on rides like this, just in case. And then I realized all they would have to do was run me down with the van, and I would be in serious trouble. As the van drew closer, I was ready to jump off and run into the cornfields. The van slowed down as it approached me, and the driver rolled his window down and leaned out again. But this time, I didn't stop riding. I increased my speed, even though I knew I could never outrun the van if they gave chase. I looked over my shoulder and saw the van sitting in the middle of the road. I took the right fork and continued on the gravel road until I could no longer see the van behind the corn rows, and then I stopped. I got off my bike and crept along the cornfield until I was at its edge, and I peeked down the road I had just been on. The van was in the distance, driving away from me. I ran back to my bike, and then as soon as the van was entirely out of sight, I turned around and took the left fork along the dirt path. I rode as fast as I could, knowing that if the people in the van had nefarious things in mind, and if they caught me on this dirt path, flanked by cornfields and far from an area that anyone would come across us, that it might be the time that they attacked. My ruse worked, or perhaps the van was never after me at all, and I made it the rest of the way to the town center without seeing them again. When I got home later that day, I was still replaying the events in my head, and the name David Crist kept creeping through my mind. Was David Crist someone famous, I wondered, like a musician? Should I have known David Crist? I decided to Google the name. I tried a couple of different spellings for Crist, but the Crist spelling revealed a terrifying result. I came across a newspaper article from Knoxville, Tennessee. The article explained how a man named David Crist had turned himself in after stabbing another man at a gas station in 2013. The article included a photo of this criminal David Crist, and I believe it was the same man that was driving the van. It had a baseball cap and a few inches of a goatee, and the man in the van was a dead ringer for David Crist, the guy in the article. I did an inmate search of the Knox County Prison, and there was no David Crist in the inmate population. Somehow, David Crist had gotten out of prison, or maybe he was never convicted, as I couldn't find any articles about sentencing. And less than 2 years after stabbing a guy for some reason, he had made his way to Michigan. Why was he driving along those back roads? Who was the woman in the passenger seat? And why the hell did he keep asking if I knew of him? Do I know David Crist? Yeah, I do now. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast or this channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you hit the notification button for every time that I upload. Leave a comment if you'd like. I'll try to get back to you as fast as possible. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And of course, you can support this channel by visiting my storefront on tpublic.com. A link to that is in the description below. And of course, you can really take it further and support me by visiting and donating to my Patreon. A link to that is down there too. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.